David stepped out of his car, the Greenville courthouse looming in front of him. The morning sun was warm, but the air felt charged with tension, as if something big was about to happen. As a federal prosecutor, David had faced his share of high-stakes cases, but today felt different. Today wasn't about courtroom drama or the weight of criminal cases. It was about something far more personal. His grandmother's house, a place where he learned life's most important lessons, was now at risk due to an unjust property tax adjustment. It should have been a simple matter to address, but things weren't going as planned. A call from his office about a human trafficking case had delayed him, and now he was late for a hearing that was about to test more than just his legal expertise. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was thick with uncertainty. The walls, worn with age, seemed to echo the voices of countless others who had stood where David now stood, fighting for justice. As he walked down the narrow hallway, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Something was waiting for him in that courtroom, and he wasn't sure what it was. When David finally entered Judge Whitman's courtroom, all eyes turned to him. The judge, a towering figure with piercing blue eyes, wasted no time. "You're late, mister," he said sharply, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. But David didn't back down. His voice was calm, controlled, even as the fine for tardiness was slapped on him. $7.50. But it wasn't just the fine that stung. It was the look in the judge's eyes. There was something deeper at play here, something David couldn't ignore. The day had only just begun, but David already knew. This wouldn't just be about a tax adjustment. It was about standing up against something much larger, something systemic, and David was ready to fight. David stepped through the heavy courthouse doors, the familiar scent of old paper and dust hanging in the air. The buzz of conversation from the crowd inside felt distant, muted, as if the world had shifted its focus entirely to him. Every step he took echoed in the long, narrow hallway, the rhythmic sound of his shoes against the cold marble floor amplifying the silence that weighed heavily on his chest. He could feel the tension building, creeping up his spine like a chill. Today wasn't just another court appearance. It wasn't about property taxes or an administrative error. No, today felt different, more ominous, more foreboding. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for him. Something he wasn't prepared for. David's hands shook ever so slightly as he adjusted his tie. He was a seasoned federal prosecutor, and yet the feeling of being late, the feeling of entering a courthouse where time was as rigid as the walls themselves, gnawed at him. He had never been late before, but today, an urgent phone call about a human trafficking case had thrown off his rhythm. He had barely managed to grab his paperwork and rush out the door in time to make it to his grandmother's property tax hearing. He passed the worn wooden doors of courtroom after courtroom, heading toward room 204. The courthouse had always seemed so different from the sleek, modern federal buildings he was used to. This place felt cramped, tired, as if time had been frozen in a forgotten era. The walls, chipped and faded, the seats cracked with use. Everything about this place seemed ancient, weighed down by the echoes of countless decisions made over the years. And yet, the air was thick with anticipation. Everyone here was waiting for something. Everyone was hoping for something. But David couldn't help but wonder if they would find justice today. He reached the door to courtroom 204 and paused for a brief moment, adjusting his posture. He straightened his shoulders and stepped in, fully expecting the usual scene of busy lawyers, clients, and the hum of small-time disputes being heard. But what greeted him instead was a heavy silence. It wasn't just the quiet of a room full of people listening. It was the silence of authority, of power, of a system that had its rules, and David, late as he was, would have to follow them. Judge Whitman entered the room just as David found a seat near the back. The judge's presence was magnetic, like a storm cloud suddenly appearing in a clear sky. Tall, with a silver mane that framed his stern, chiseled face, Whitman commanded the room without saying a word. His piercing blue eyes scanned the space with a sharpness that seemed to cut through the air. His gaze passed over the people, scrutinizing each individual with the authority only an experienced judge could wield. And when those eyes landed on David, there was an unmistakable shift, a tightening in the air, a new layer of tension. The bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise!" The command echoed off the walls, sharp and immediate. David stood along with everyone else, feeling the weight of the room's collective gaze. The air, thick with unspoken expectations, wrapped itself around him like a suffocating blanket. Judge Whitman settled into his chair with a fluidity that spoke of years of authority. As the murmur of people sitting back down died down, he wasted no time, immediately diving into the list of cases. His tone was brisk, mechanical, devoid of emotion. He wasn't here for pleasantries, and no one was allowed to waste his time. David noticed a few individuals, latecomers like himself, slinking into their seats, trying not to attract attention. A middle-aged man in a suit, clearly flustered, slipped into the room unnoticed. He wasn't reprimanded, nor was the young woman in casual clothes who arrived minutes after the judge had begun calling cases. Both settled in, pulling out their phones or papers, and without a word, the judge continued his work. David felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had been late, but so had they. Why was it that the judge had chosen to ignore their tardiness? But his own had been treated like a cardinal sin. Something about the way he was being looked at, something in the atmosphere of the courtroom, unsettled him. His heart raced as he thought about it. Why was it that the rules seemed to change depending on who you were? "Mr. Robinson?" The judge's voice snapped suddenly, cutting through David's thoughts like a blade. "Your turn." David rose, the eyes of the room on him as he moved to the front. His palms were clammy, but he steadied himself. He had prepared. He was ready to present his case. But something about the judge's cold expression made him hesitate, just for a moment. He had dealt with tough judges before, but this one felt different. His presence loomed over David, as if daring him to challenge him as he approached the podium. The judge's eyes flickered up, and for the briefest of moments, David saw a flash of something in them. A judgment, a dismissal, an unspoken challenge. The judge's lips twitched, almost imperceptibly, and then his voice rang out. "You're late, Mr. Robinson," Judge Whitman said, his voice laced with thinly veiled contempt. "Do you think the court's time is less valuable than your own?" David stood firm, his breath steady, though his heart was racing. He opened his mouth to respond, but the judge interrupted him before he could say a word. "Excuses don't excuse tardiness," Whitman snapped. "This court operates on order and respect. If you can't follow that, I suggest you reevaluate your priorities." David's stomach twisted. He could feel every eye on him. The weight of the courtroom's expectations settled on his shoulders like an unbearable load. But one thought kept swirling in his mind. Why was he the only one being punished? In that instant, David knew that this wasn't just about a minor late arrival. This was about something far larger. A system where power was wielded not in the name of fairness, but in the name of authority, and maybe, just maybe, something more. David stood at the podium, his folder clutched tightly in his hands, the weight of what was unfolding in the courtroom pressing on him. He had been through countless cases, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. As he glanced around the room, he could feel the silent eyes of the spectators, the unspoken judgment hanging thick in the air. Every inch of the courtroom felt like it was closing in on him. "Mr. Robinson, you're late." Judge Whitman's voice sliced through the stillness, cold and unyielding. David's throat tightened, but he kept his composure. This wasn't about a property tax adjustment anymore. It wasn't even about the fine. This was about something far more insidious. He took a deep breath. "Your Honor, I apologize for the delay. I was attending to urgent federal matters. I had a motion filed last minute in a human trafficking case. It required my immediate attention." "Excuses don't excuse tardiness," the judge snapped, his voice a sharp command. "This court operates on order and respect. If you can't follow that, perhaps you need to reconsider your priorities." David's heart raced, but he stayed calm, his voice even, though his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. The absurdity of it all struck him. The judge had no idea who he was dealing with. He had no idea what he had just dismissed as an excuse. This wasn't just another case, it was a matter of life and death for the victims he was fighting for. "I understand the importance of timeliness," David said slowly, forcing himself to maintain the calm that was now slipping away. "But if I may, I'd like to present my case regarding the property tax adjustment. This is about my family's home, the house my grandmother left me." Whitman waved a dismissive hand, signaling that David's words meant little. "We'll get to that in a moment. First, there's the matter of contempt. Tardiness undermines the integrity of these proceedings. You are hereby fined $750. David felt the words hit him like a physical blow. He bit down hard on the anger that threatened to rise up in him. $750 for being late? For a federal prosecutor who had been working to save lives? For a case that had nothing to do with petty legal wrangling? The injustice of it gnawed at him. Around him, murmurs rippled through the room. He could feel the eyes on him, a mix of disbelief, curiosity, and, perhaps, a little discomfort. But it wasn't just about the fine. It was the stark, undeniable disparity. He looked around the room, catching sight of a middle-aged man in a suit who had arrived well after the judge had started calling cases. Not a word was said to him, nor to the young woman in casual clothes who had slipped in late and was now scrolling on her phone. No reprimand, no gavel. Just a quiet acceptance of their presence. David's mind raced. He couldn't ignore it. The double standard was glaring. He was the only one treated with such contempt for his tardiness. And for what? Because he was black? Because he didn't fit the judge's idea of who should be in his courtroom? The realization hit him like a thunderclap. This wasn't just a simple case of being late. This was about race. This was about power. This was about a system that had been turning a blind eye to discrimination for far too long. As the judge continued with the next case, David could feel his blood pressure rising. He was seething, but he couldn't let it show. He opened his folder, but instead of focusing on the property tax documents, his pen moved quickly across the page, writing furiously. He had to document everything, every look, every word, every action. The courtroom moved forward, but David was no longer listening to the cases being called. His mind was consumed with the injustice of it all. The more he thought about it, the more his anger turned to resolve. He couldn't let this go. He wouldn't let it. Finally, his name was called again. He stood, his legs steady, but his insides were a roiling storm. He returned to the podium, his folder now a symbol of the fight he was about to wage. The judge looked up at him with that same piercing gaze. "Your Honor," David began, his voice now hard and unyielding, "I have documentation regarding the erroneous property tax adjustment. This house has been in my family for decades. The city's new assessment is a 30% increase, without proper notification or explanation." Judge Whitman leaned back in his chair, looking at David with a disinterested air, as if everything David said was irrelevant, just a distraction from the real issue at hand. "I'll review it in due time, Mr. Robinson. However, your tardiness this morning is a matter we cannot overlook. Do you truly believe your federal responsibilities justify disrespecting this court?" David held the judge's gaze. "Your Honor, I believe every case, every person, deserves respect. And that includes the victims I'm fighting for in the human trafficking case. But that doesn't mean I don't respect this court. I understand the importance of rules. But I must ask, are those rules applied equally to everyone in this room?" The room went silent. David's words hung in the air like a challenge, daring the judge to deny it. The tension was palpable. David could feel it. The collective breath held, the unspoken question on everyone's minds. Would the judge acknowledge the disparity? Or would he double down? The judge's face hardened, his lips thinning into a tight line. "Are you questioning the integrity of this court?" he demanded. David didn't flinch. "I'm asking for clarity, Your Honor. Fairness should be applied equally to everyone here. I would appreciate it if that standard was upheld." The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack, silencing David's words. "Your fine stands," he said curtly, not even looking up from his papers. David inclined his head slightly, his voice calm. "Thank you, Your Honor." As he returned to his seat, the weight of the room's eyes upon him felt unbearable. But David didn't care. He was no longer just fighting for a property tax adjustment. He was fighting for something far more important: the right to be treated with dignity and respect. And he wasn't going to let this moment pass unnoticed. Not by him and not by anyone else in that room. David sat back in his seat, his heart pounding, his mind racing. The gavel's sharp crack still echoed in his ears, the judge's words vibrating in his chest. $750. A fine for being late, something so trivial yet so charged with meaning. The unfairness of it all burned in his gut. But it was more than just the fine. It was what had happened before. The way the judge had dismissed his explanation, as though it meant nothing. The way his tardiness had been treated as a personal affront, while others were allowed to slip in without consequence. David's eyes scanned the room. His gaze moved from person to person, but one thing became glaringly clear: the disparity was right there in front of him. The man in the gray blazer, who had arrived several minutes after the judge had started calling cases, had not been called out. The young woman in the casual clothes who had sauntered in, phone in hand, had been completely ignored. No reprimand, no fine, no sharp words from the judge. Yet here he was, a seasoned federal prosecutor, fined for something that others had gotten away with. His breath hitched. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about being late. This wasn't about a small matter in a courtroom filled with minor infractions. This was something deeper. This was something systemic. This was racial discrimination. David clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He had seen it before. He'd seen it in the looks people gave him, the way they doubted him, the way they expected less from him because of the color of his skin. But he had never expected to see it so openly, so blatantly, in a place like this. A place where justice was supposed to be blind. But there was nothing blind about it. The judge had seen him, all right. He had seen him for exactly what he was. A black man in a courtroom. A man who didn't belong in this system. Not according to him. David's chest tightened as his thoughts swirled. The more he thought about it, the more it became clear. The fine wasn't just about him. It wasn't even just about the judge's bias. It was a symptom of something much larger. Pattern. A system that had allowed this kind of discrimination to fester unchecked. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a fluke. It was the way things were supposed to work in this courtroom. The weight of the injustice crashed over him. He thought about all the other people who had been in that room before, the ones who didn't have the privilege of standing up for themselves, the ones who didn't have the legal knowledge or resources to challenge a system that was so clearly stacked against them. How many people had been treated this way? How many had been silenced, ignored, or punished simply because of who they were? He couldn't let this go. He couldn't be another person who just walked away from something so obvious, so wrong. His job wasn't just to prosecute cases, it was to make sure the system worked. To make sure it worked for everyone, not just the ones who looked like the judge or the ones who played by the unwritten rules of power. His stomach churned. He was a part of the system, but today the system had failed him. And he wasn't going to stand by and let it continue. The room buzzed with the sound of the next case being called, but David didn't hear it. He didn't care. His mind was elsewhere. The injustice, the inequality, it was suffocating, pressing in on him from all sides. But there was something else, something burning at the core of his being. A fire, a resolve. He couldn't let this moment pass. He couldn't just accept what had happened as one more instance of the way things were. He had to do something. His heart raced as he stood up, his legs stiff, but his mind clear. He walked back to the podium, the eyes of the room on him. The judge barely looked up as he approached, his eyes still focused on the paperwork in front of him. But David wasn't there to argue about the fine. He wasn't there to fight about a tardiness violation. He was there to fight for something far more important. "Your Honor," he began, his voice calm but firm. "I have to ask, are the rules applied equally to everyone in this courtroom?" The words hung in the air, like a challenge, like a defiant spark in the middle of a room filled with unspoken tension. David stood tall, his gaze locked on the judge, refusing to look away. The silence stretched, the eyes of the room shifting from David to the judge. For a moment, it felt like the entire courtroom was holding its breath, waiting for a response. Judge Whitman's face reddened, and his lips tightened. "Are you questioning the integrity of this court?" he snapped, his voice sharp, his eyes flashing with irritation. David didn't flinch. "I'm not questioning the court, Your Honor. I'm asking for fairness. I'm asking for clarity. Because what happened here today wasn't just about tardiness. It was about something much bigger." The room was still. The murmurs that had filled the space earlier vanished. David felt the weight of everyone's gaze. They were watching him. They were waiting. And in that moment, he knew that this wasn't just about one judge, one case. It was about the entire system. The very system that had allowed this kind of injustice to exist, unchecked and unapologetic, that he had opened a door. And now, there was no turning back. David's heart pounded in his chest, louder than the rhythmic tapping of the judge's gavel on the wood. His words, sharp and deliberate, hung in the air, piercing through the room's suffocating silence. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if the judge would rise to the challenge or shut him down completely. But he couldn't go back. Not now. The judge's lips curled into a thin line, his eyes narrowing as they locked with David's. For a moment, the tension was unbearable, the room as still as a frozen lake before a storm. The eyes of the spectators, the bailiffs, and even the court clerk were all fixed on David, waiting for the fallout. No one spoke. No one moved. Judge Whitman's voice cut through the stillness, low and menacing. "Are you questioning the integrity of this court, Mr. Robinson?" David stood tall, his breath steady, though his mind was anything but calm. This was no longer just about him, about a simple tax adjustment or the unfair fine. This was about something much deeper, something that had been brewing in the shadows for far too long. It was about challenging a system that had silently allowed discrimination to thrive, where the color of your skin could determine your fate before you even opened your mouth. "I'm not questioning the court, Your Honor," David said, his voice unwavering, though his insides churned with the weight of what he was about to say. "I'm asking for fairness, for clarity. What happened here today isn't just about me being late. It's about something much larger, something that's been happening for years. Right here, in your courtroom." David's words hung in the air, and the silence that followed felt suffocating. His gaze never wavered from the judges, even as Whitman's face turned a shade darker, his jaw clenching with barely concealed anger. "You are out of line, Mr. Robinson," the judge spat, his gavel raised in warning. "I will not tolerate accusations against this court. You will not stand here and undermine my authority." David's pulse quickened, but he didn't step back. His mind was clear now. He had already made his decision. This was no longer a debate over one fine or one late arrival. This was about exposing the quiet, systemic discrimination that was woven into the fabric of the court, into the very structure of the law. And no matter the personal cost, David wasn't going to walk away from it. "The fine wasn't the issue, Your Honor," David continued, his voice still steady but now filled with quiet resolve. "It's the way I was treated, the way others in this courtroom were treated differently. There was no reprimand for the man who arrived after me. There was no reprimand for the young woman who was late, too. Why was I the only one punished?" The words rang out in the silence, and David could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him now. The murmurs began, soft at first, but growing louder with each passing second. Some were questioning the judge's behavior. Others were simply watching, unsure of how this would unfold. But David could feel it. The shift in the room, the weight of the collective consciousness turning towards the injustice that had just been exposed. Judge Whitman's face reddened with fury, his knuckles white around the gavel. He was a man who had never been challenged like this, and the power he once held in that courtroom now felt like it was slipping away. His authority, once unquestioned, was now in question, and David had no intention of backing down. "You will not speak to me like this in my courtroom," Whitman's voice thundered, his grip tightening on the gavel. "You will apologize for this disrespect, or you will leave. Now." David felt a moment of heat rise in his chest, but he refused to let it control him. He took a deep breath, holding the tension in his body steady. His mind was clear now, sharper than ever before. He wasn't about to back down. He couldn't. Not for himself. Not for the countless others who had walked into this courtroom, silenced, dismissed, punished for reasons they could never change. "I won't apologize for seeking fairness, Your Honor," David replied, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that couldn't be ignored. "I won't apologize for standing up when I see something wrong, and I won't apologize for challenging the system when it fails to deliver justice." The room was dead silent now. Even the judge's gavel hung motionless in his hand. David could see the shift in the room, in the way people were starting to look at the judge, starting to realize the truth that had been hidden for so long. This wasn't just about one fine. It was about the cracks in a system that was supposed to serve everyone equally, but had failed far too many. The judge stood there, his face contorted in rage, but also something else, a flicker of uncertainty, of fear. For the first time, David saw the judge's power begin to slip, and he felt a surge of quiet triumph. But it wasn't over yet. David's words were not just a challenge to the judge. They were a challenge to the entire system. The silence that filled the courtroom was heavy, but it was no longer oppressive. It was full of the possibility of change. And for the first time, David felt something else. Hope. David sat alone in his office, the glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls. His mind raced, the events of the day playing over and over in his head like a loop he couldn't stop. The courtroom, the gavel, the judge's face, the disparity, the anger, the fear. His heart still pounded in his chest as if he were still standing there, facing Whitman's wrath that he had always believed in the system. He had worked tirelessly to ensure justice was served. But today he had seen how easily the system could be manipulated, how a single moment of power could distort everything, how someone's skin color could change the course of a case. He wasn't just a federal prosecutor anymore. He was a witness, a victim of a broken system that was supposed to be just, but had clearly failed him. And so many others. David's fingers trembled slightly as he reached for his phone, tapping out a message to Julia. "We need to talk. It's bigger than just the fine." The message sent, and David exhaled slowly. His gaze fell to the documents spread across his desk, the case files, the notes, the tax assessment papers for his grandmother's house. It had started as a simple property tax dispute, but now it was something much more dangerous. He wasn't just going after an unfair tax increase anymore. He was going after a system that was corrupt at its core, a system that had allowed racial bias to flourish under the guise of order and law. Minutes later, Julia called. "David, what's going on?" Her voice was soft, but he could hear the concern beneath it. "You sounded urgent in your message." David leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "It's worse than I thought. The judge, the whole system, it's rigged. What happened today wasn't just about me being late. It's about the way things work. The way people of color get treated differently. We need to do something." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Julia spoke again, her voice low but firm. "What do you mean? Are you saying you want to take legal action against the judge?" David's breath caught. This was it, the moment when everything would change. "Yes, we can't just let this slide. We can't let this be just another story that fades away. I'm going to file a formal complaint. I'm going to gather every piece of evidence I have, everything I've seen, everything I've documented, and we're going to take this to the Judicial Review Commission." Julia's voice wavered, a mix of fear and admiration. "David, this could destroy everything you've worked for. This isn't just about a judge being unfair. This is a system that's been in place for years. You're taking on a lot." David swallowed hard. He knew the risks. He knew how high the stakes were. But there was no turning back now. "I'm already in too deep, and if we don't speak up, who will? If I don't fight this, it'll just keep happening. People like me, people who look like me, they'll keep getting pushed aside, treated like we don't matter. I can't let that happen." Julia was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was steady, resolute. "Okay, let's do it. We'll start gathering evidence. We'll make sure we have everything. And when we go public, we do it right. No half measures." David could hear her typing in the background, and he knew she was already thinking ahead. The two of them had worked together on countless cases before, but this was different. This wasn't just about the law. This was about everything they stood for. This was about making sure that every person who walked into that courthouse was treated equally, no matter their race, their background, or their story. "Thanks, Julia," David said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't do this without you." "I've got your back, David. We'll make sure this gets heard." The call ended, and David sat there in the silence, his mind spinning. The weight of what was to come settled on him like a heavy cloak. The fight ahead wouldn't be easy. He was about to expose a system that didn't want to be exposed, and he knew the road would be long and full of obstacles. But he was ready. He had to be. He glanced at the clock on his desk. Late, far later than he should have been working. But there was no time to rest. Not now. He grabbed the files from his desk and began organizing them with purpose, each paper, each document, each note a small piece of the larger puzzle he was about to assemble as he worked. A quiet resolve settled within him. He wasn't just taking on a corrupt judge anymore. He was taking on a system that needed to be changed. And David was going to make sure that it happened, no matter what it took. The fight for justice had just begun. The investigation into Judge Whitman began quietly, but David could feel the storm building. It was one thing to see the injustice firsthand in the courtroom. It was another to bring it to light, to hold those in power accountable. He and Julia worked tirelessly, gathering testimonies from those who had witnessed Whitman's behavior, digging into the judge's history, and searching for any pattern of bias that could support their case. David couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, the faces of the people who had been treated unjustly in that courtroom flashed before him. The man in the gray blazer, the young woman on her phone, and most of all, the feeling of being singled out, of being punished for something as insignificant as being late, when others had received nothing more than a glance. But now they were about to dig into the past, the cases, the records, the truth. The first few weeks were filled with the quiet hum of investigation. David combed through case files, cross-referencing names, dates, and judgments. Julia reached out to anyone who might have had an experience with the judge, court staff, former defendants, even attorneys who had worked under Whitman. Slowly, the pieces began to fall into place. It wasn't just one incident of bias. It was a pattern, a disturbing pattern that stretched back years. Black defendants were fined more often than their white counterparts. Late arrivals from white defendants were often ignored, while late black defendants faced reprimands and fines. Small infractions from white defendants went unpunished, while black defendants faced harsher treatment. At it was enough to make David's stomach turn. Then came the breakthrough. A former bailiff, a man named James Wilson, had worked under Judge Whitman for over a decade. He had seen it all. He had witnessed the judge's discriminatory behavior time and time again, but he had kept quiet, until now. James agreed to sit down with David and Julia. His voice trembled as he spoke, and David could hear the weight of years of silence in his words. "I've seen how he treats people differently," James said, his voice heavy with regret. "It's always been there, right under the surface. But I didn't think anyone would believe me if I spoke out. I thought I'd lose my job, maybe even worse. But what happened to you, David, that was the final straw. I can't stay quiet anymore." James's testimony became the key that unlocked the floodgates. As more people came forward, the stories began to pile up. A young black woman had been fined $1,000 for a minor parking violation, while a white man with multiple offenses had only been charged $200. Another defendant, a black man, had been interrupted and belittled by Judge Whitman, while a white defendant in the same position had been allowed to speak without interruption. Each story fueled David's resolve, but it also made his heart ache. How many people had been through this? How many had suffered in silence, afraid to speak out, too scared to challenge the system? The pain in their voices echoed in his mind, and with every new piece of evidence, the pressure-mounted word of the investigation began to spread, and soon, the community response exploded. It started with whispers, but soon it became a chorus of voices demanding justice. Activist groups rallied outside the courthouse, holding signs that read, "End bias now," and "Justice should be blind." Local news outlets picked up the story, and soon the entire city was talking about the judge's actions, about the injustice that had been allowed to fester in their very own courtroom. But not everyone was supportive. Whitman's allies, fellow judges, local officials, and some members of the legal community dismissed the claims. They painted David as a troublemaker, a disgruntled employee trying to tear down a respected figure. They said he was overreacting, that he was taking things too far. But David wasn't backing down. With every attack, every attempt to discredit him, his resolve only hardened. He wasn't doing this for himself. He was doing this for every person who had been mistreated in that courtroom, for every voice that had been silenced as the investigation gathered momentum. Julia sat with David one evening, her voice filled with concern. "This is bigger than we thought," she said. "The judge isn't just a bad apple. This is systemic. There's a whole network of people who have been turning a blind eye to this for years." David nodded, the weight of the truth settling heavily on his shoulders. He could feel the pressure mounting, the eyes of the community on him, the growing sense of urgency as the investigation gained more traction. They were about to take this fight to the next level. Soon, they would file the formal complaint with the Judicial Review Commission, and the public would know the truth. But David couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The system was about to be exposed for all its flaws, its deep-seated biases. And no matter how hard they tried to hide it, the truth was coming, and David was going to make sure it saw the light of day. The moment the formal complaint against Judge Whitman was filed, the world seemed to shift on its axis. David felt the weight of the documents in his hand like an anchor, a symbol of the battle he had just begun. The Judicial Review Commission had officially opened an investigation into the judge's practices, and with it, the floodgates were thrown wide open. The eyes of the entire legal community and the city were now on the case. What had started as a single moment of injustice in a courtroom had grown into a movement. The pressure was immense. As the weeks passed, the story spread beyond the courthouse. News outlets, once hesitant, were now covering the case in depth. Local activists organized protests, calling for systemic changes in the way the court handled cases. "End bias now" echoed through the streets, printed on placards, shared on social media, shouted from every corner of the city. People who had once been silent found their voices. They began to speak up about their own experiences, about the unfairness they had endured, the silent discrimination they had accepted for far too long. But with the growing public support came the backlash. Whitman's allies, the well-established figures who had once respected him, began to circle the wagons. They attacked David's character, called the investigation a witch hunt, and tried to discredit him at every turn. The media storm intensified. In quiet meetings behind closed doors, whispers began to circulate about what might happen next. Would David be left out in the cold, his career ruined? Would the truth even come to light? David knew the risks. The pressure mounted with each passing day. His phone rang constantly, his inbox filled with messages from colleagues, activists, and reporters. Everyone wanted answers, but all David could think about was the next step. The truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. He had to see this through, not just for himself, but for the countless others who had suffered in silence. Then came the bombshell. A former court employee who had worked under Whitman for years contacted David. Her testimony was shocking. She confirmed that Whitman had made racially biased decisions, even in the courtroom, and that it was well known among the staff. She described how some cases were handled with a blatant disregard for the law, depending on the defendant's race. The information she provided was damning, and with it, the investigation gained even more traction. The tipping point came when a special hearing was scheduled by the Judicial Review Commission. The room was packed with reporters, lawyers, activists, and citizens. The air was thick with anticipation. Felt like the entire city was holding its breath. David sat at the front, his palms sweating, his heart thudding in his chest. He knew that this was it, the moment everything would change. The room fell silent as the commission's lead investigator stepped forward. The findings were read aloud, and with each word, the weight of the truth became undeniable. Judge Whitman's practices were no longer in question. They had been documented, corroborated, and confirmed. The systemic bias that David had fought to expose was now a proven fact. The shockwaves were immediate. Whitman, who had once held such power in that courtroom, was now the target of widespread outrage. The community rallied behind David, showing up in droves to support the demand for justice. People who had once been afraid to speak out found the courage to share their own stories, recounting how they had been wronged by the very system that was supposed to protect them. And then, the inevitable happened. Whitman resigned. The announcement came quietly, but the ripple effect was anything but. The judge, once a towering figure in the legal community, was now a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with the system. His resignation was a victory, but it was not the end. It was a sign that change was possible, that standing up against injustice could, in fact, make a difference. The fallout from Whitman's resignation was swift. The Judicial Review Commission issued a public statement calling for widespread reforms in the legal system. Bias training was mandated for all court staff, and new policies were put in place to ensure transparency and accountability. For the first time, the city began to seriously grapple with the systemic issues that had long been ignored. But the changes went beyond policy. The very culture of the courtroom was shifting. Young law students, once hesitant to speak out, now found themselves inspired by David's courage. Activists, once marginalized, now found their voices heard. And the community, finally united, began to see that their fight for justice was not just about one man or one case. It was about transforming a system that had long been broken. David stood in front of the courthouse, watching as the crowds gathered for a rally. His heart was still heavy with the weight of what had happened. But there was something else now. A sense of hope. A sense that the fight for fairness, for equality, had just begun, and that it would continue no matter the obstacles in their way. The legal system wasn't perfect, but now, at least, it had been forced to look itself in the mirror. And David knew, in his heart, that it would never be the same again. The aftermath of Judge Whitman's resignation marked a pivotal moment, not just for the courthouse in Greenville, but for the entire legal system. What had started as a single act of injustice, a fine for tardiness, had grown into a sweeping reform movement, one that reshaped how bias and discrimination were handled within the court system. The public outcry, fueled by David's courage and determination, was the spark that set everything into motion. But what happened after that? The reforms were swift and powerful. The Judicial Review Commission's decision to implement mandatory bias training for all court staff was a significant first step. It wasn't enough to simply expose the problem. It was essential to ensure that everyone who worked in the system understood the depth of the issue and was equipped to challenge it. No longer would the prejudices of individuals go unchecked. The new policies required that all court decisions be transparently recorded and reviewed, ensuring that any unjust practices would be spotted and corrected immediately. But the real transformation happened within the community. The actions taken were not just a response to the injustice David had faced. They ignited a wave of awareness, empathy, and action. People began talking openly about their own experiences with systemic bias, something that had been hidden in the shadows for far too long. The awareness raised wasn't confined to just the courthouse or the city of Greenville. It spread across the country, inspiring people everywhere to stand up and speak out. David's work didn't end with the resignation of Judge Whitman. The battle wasn't just about one judge's misconduct. It was about the systemic issues that allowed that misconduct to persist. The true measure of the change, in David's eyes, was in the ripple effect it created. By exposing the flaws in the system, by challenging an entrenched power structure, David had helped ignite a movement that was bigger than any one individual or case. For the first time, the people who had been silenced found their voice. The once ignored members of the community who had felt powerless in the face of the law were now speaking up, demanding a system that worked for everyone, not just for the privileged few. In his role as a prosecutor, David had always fought for justice, but this was different. It wasn't just about criminal cases. It was about fighting for equity and fairness in every corner of the legal world. And the changes didn't stop at policy or community involvement. The legal system itself was restructured in profound ways. The courts became more transparent, more accountable, and more committed to fairness. New oversight committees were formed, and judges were held to a higher standard, with clear consequences for any future abuses of power. The impact was felt not only in Greenville, but across the country, as other states began looking to the model of reform David had helped set in motion. What we can learn from this is simple, but powerful. Standing up for what's right is never easy. It takes courage, persistence, and the willingness to face incredible opposition. David could have walked away after the fine was imposed, resigned to the idea that some things simply couldn't be changed. But instead, he chose to take action, to fight not just for his own dignity, but for the dignity of others who had been overlooked, marginalized, and ignored. This story shows us the power of one voice, one person, to spark change. It reminds us that justice is not just about following the rules. It's about ensuring that those rules are fair, that they are applied equally to everyone. It's about creating a system that serves all people, regardless of race, background, or status. David's journey also teaches us that when we stand together, when we speak up for what we believe in, we create a ripple effect. One small action, one small decision to act with integrity can change the course of history. We can all be the catalysts for positive change in our own communities. So what's next? As we continue to push for fairness and equality, it's essential that we remain vigilant, that we never stop questioning the status quo, and that we hold ourselves accountable for the future we want to create. If you're inspired by David's story, by the change he's helped bring about, I encourage you to take action. Whether it's speaking out against injustice, educating yourself about systemic issues, or simply being there for someone who needs support, we all have a part to play in creating a more just and equitable world. If you've enjoyed this story, and you're passionate about change and justice, be sure to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring content. Together, we can continue to create the world we want to see. Thank you for watching, and remember, the fight for justice never stops. Each of us has the power to make a difference.